Welcome to What Matters to Me and Why here at UCI. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jane Page, a member of the organizing committee with the honor of introducing the program today. First of all, apologies for any technical difficulties we encounter as we're navigating this hybrid form of presentation. We want to acknowledge the Chancellor and the committee who make these presentations possible. The program itself started in 2012, and it's blossomed into include an alumni series and a medical school series. Be sure to check these exciting opportunities out too on our website. For those of you who are attending their first event, we really want you to know you're in for a unique experience. Speakers are asked simply and authentically to answer the question, what matters to you and why? And then take it wherever it goes. The series provides a forum for speakers to talk about values, beliefs, motivations, and personal experiences they have encountered throughout their lives. The hope is that we strengthen the bonds between faculty, students, and staff who teach, learn, and work here on campus, and we celebrate the diversity in the community and the commonalities that bind us together. At the end of the talk, there's time for a question and answer period with the audience. We'll soon hear from Kevin Bossemeyer, who will introduce our speaker, Professor Hector Tobar. What Matters to Me and Why has a couple of traditions. We usually start by taking a couple minutes to introduce ourselves to our neighbor. So those of you that are here in Crystal Cove, please do just that. Turn to your neighbor and introduce yourself. And for those of you that are remote, we will magically transport you to breakout rooms and we'll ask you to take a moment to meet your roommates, find out where they're based at UCI, and then we'll return to the room to start our presentation. Will Alvarez is in the back of the room who will magically take us away.
Welcome back. That's one of my favorite parts of What Matters to Me and Why. My name's Kevin Bossemeyer. I'm on the committee for What Matters to Me and Why, and I'm also a public affairs host, interviewer on KUCI 88.9 FM in Irvine. My show's UCI Conversations, where every Wednesday from 4 to 5 p.m. we explore another corner of this amazing place that we work and go to school at. And that's where I met our special guest today, about 4 months ago. Professor Hector Tobar is and teaches Chicano Latino Studies, English, and literary journalism. He received his undergrad degree at UC Santa Cruz and his MFA in creative writing from right here on our campus. He has an amazing wealth of experience in the areas that he teaches. He's written 5 books, including the best-selling Deep Down Dark, the story of the 33 Chilean miners who in 2010 captured the attention of the world when they were trapped for 69 days underground until they were miraculously rescued. Hector's book became the basis for the major motion picture The 33, starring Antonio Banderas. It's good. He also has written for national magazines and dailies, numerous ones, as well as spending 18 years at the Los Angeles Times when it was a thick newspaper. And some of the writing hats that he wore while there was as a Metro reporter and columnist. He also was a bureau chief in Buenos Aires and also Mexico City. He was assigned to Iraq for a time, and he was also part of the 1992 Pulitzer Prize winning team that covered the Los Angeles riots. One of my favorite quotes from Professor Tobar when I interviewed him, and this is when I knew that he was the real deal, is when he said, and I quote, "Journalism teaches me again and again that you never really know the fullness and the complexity of the human experience until you begin to ask questions and step into that experience." And that was a tremendous moment in my early career, and it's happened to me over and over again. You never really know what you're going to find out. Just like today. Our question for Professor Tobar is, what matters to you and why? Not as easy as it sounds, but we are excited to find out. Please give a great big, warm, enthusiastic, and encouraging welcome to our Master of Creative Writing, Professor Tobar.
Thanks so much for that really fantastic introduction. It's wonderful to be here. Really one of the greatest jobs I've ever had is to be a UCI professor. And what I want to talk about today is something that's really important, not just to me, but I think to almost every student whose path has crossed with mine in my career here at Irvine, especially where there are so many Latino students. And that thing is reading. I'm a writer, professional writer. I came here to UC Irvine to become, to sort of take my writing career and give it some stability, the stability of a tenured job. And it's really been this incredible, crazy journey. It's a very unlikely journey. And I want to talk today a little bit about some of the kind of crazy, spiritual, mystical encounters that have taken place on my journey into becoming a writer, and also about just some of the books and some of the writers that have helped to guide and inform my journey into writing. And so this slide here is of my late grandmother, my paternal grandmother, my father's mother, Valeria Cruz, and my family is Guatemalan immigrants. So my grandmother here, Valeria, she was almost certainly part Mayan Indian, although she wouldn't admit to it. Spoke Spanish growing up, moved at a very early age to eastern Guatemala after she was orphaned. From my interview with her many, many years ago, I'm pretty sure that she lost her family in the Great Flu epidemic at the first part of the 20th century. And she migrated to eastern Guatemala, where she met the man who would become her, lover. They were never married, and they would have 2 kids together, including my father. And so my father and met my mother in Guatemala City, and they eventually migrated to Los Angeles. And so I'm the son of Guatemalan immigrants. Like many people on this campus, I'm the son of immigrants. And many, many years later, when I was a writer at the Los Angeles Times, I wrote a story about adult illiteracy in Southern California, and how there are many people who have their roots in Central American, Mexican villages where their parents couldn't send them to school, especially young women, especially girls. It's a problem in Latin America among the very poor. There's a very high rate of female illiteracy. And so I published this column in the LA Times. My father came to visit me a couple of days afterwards, and he was carrying this document, a photocopy of this document. And it's my grandmother's passport from one of the times that she visited us in Los Angeles. And you can see here written vertically, it says, Firma del Portador. So signature of the person holding this document. And you can see an X, and then someone has written, Ignora firmar, which means does not know how to read and write. So my grandmother was illiterate. And it was my father's great secret. He didn't tell me until I was in my 40s. And I'd published already 4 books. He didn't tell me that my grandmother was illiterate. And he said that he had carried the shame his whole life. He had tried to teach her a few letters when he was a teenager. She said, no, it's too late for me. And so I have this in my past, 2 or 3 generations back in our family, we have this illiteracy. And I was thinking about this yesterday as I was listening to my 17-year-old daughter and my 25-year-old son talk about Camus and talk about absurdity. And then they started talking about other books they had read. And I thought, my God, what a journey. A journey that I've seen in 3 generations to go from being illiterate and being a lifelong housekeeper, which is what my grandmother was, to being an educated person, a person who enjoys the luxury, right, of reading books about great ideas. And so that's where my journey starts. Now, I grew up, went to high school in South Whittier. Grew up originally in East Hollywood. I'm going to talk more about East Hollywood in a second. But I went to high school in South Whittier in what I think would be, could be described as a cultural desert. There were no independent bookstores in South Whittier. It was a very working class, unincorporated neighborhood. I remember being very intimidated when I went to college because I had not really been ever in an intellectual environment, right? It was a very working class neighborhood. The only time I can remember buying a book in South Whittier was going to the mall and buying a Bible. At the store, right? At a drugstore, I bought a Bible. They had a little section of books and there was a Bible. And that's the only time I can remember buying a book from a store growing up. So I grew up in this cultural desert. And so it's a very unlikely place that would give birth to a writer. I don't know any other writer who was born in South Whittier. I'm sure there's at least one out there because it's a city, a community, unincorporated community of about 150,000 people. But it doesn't have a great literary tradition, I'll say that, okay? And so, well, where does my journey as a writer in terms of, loving writing begin? Well, it begins with Dr. Seuss, like for many of us. And I have a specific memory of this particular Dr. Seuss book, the Dr. Seuss ABC. And maybe it's one of my earliest childhood memories, and it's of me and my mother standing in the hallway outside of my kindergarten classroom, and Mrs. Webb, my kindergarten teacher, telling my mother, "You should buy this boy a book. He likes to read. You should buy him some books like this one." And she ended up buying a Dr. Seuss book for me. So this was the first book that my family owned for me to read. My father had other books, but for me to read, this was the first book. And, I think about Dr. Seuss a lot because as I've become a writer and as I've sometimes had books that sold many copies, I've learned to understand why it is that people read. And, people read for information, right? They read because they want to know why 33 guys got trapped in a mine and what it was like to be trapped in a mine. Or they read to be transported, right? To be transported into the life of an undocumented immigrant, right? I'm talking about 2 of my books. And they read to be transported, but they also read for love of language. And for me, love of language is something that I learned, and I can, in my deepest part of my brain that I can remember, is the rhymes and the wordplay, right, of Dr. Seuss. And I think that holds for many of us who grow up in the United States. This is our first introduction into the beauty of the sound of words, of the idea that sounds and letters can make up ideas and they can describe things, right? And so Dr. Seuss was the beginning. And the first expensive present my father ever bought for me when I was probably still in elementary school was the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language. And in the years since it was a copy of the first edition, and in the years since I've actually purchased 2 more. I think I've purchased the 3rd and the 4th editions also of the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language. And to me, I realized, when my father told me that his mother was illiterate, that when my father bought me this really expensive gift, he was a person whose mother could not read a word in any language, and he was giving me all the words in English. And this dictionary is amazing. I was telling my kids, I was showing my son this slide, and he said, "Papa, that's a really geeky present to get, right? To get and to treasure." But this dictionary is amazing. Of course, it has all of these illustrations on the side, but the meat of it, of course, it taught me to treat language with respect, and it taught me that language is grounded in history, right? Has these incredible etymologies, word histories. They have usage panels where they discuss how, what is the correct, usage of a given word. I was reading this morning as I was preparing for this talk, the word history of the word ofe, which, excuse me, is a slur, an ethnic slur for white people. My apologies. Where does the word au fait come from? Well, according to this word history, well, some people say it's faux backwards in Pig Latin, right? Au fait. But also it might be a Yoruba word, which there's a Yoruba word au fait, which means was something you evoke when you're trying to protect yourself from harm. Au fait, right? And so this dictionary, which I treasured, and I actually own a fourth copy on my phone. I have the complete American Heritage Dictionary on my phone. I paid for it as an app. This dictionary really is a really important foundation for me as a writer, because I tell my students, I still consult the dictionary approximately 100 times a week. Not just to spell words, but also because I'm insecure about the usage of words that are at the fringes of my vocabulary, right? And I'm always trying to expand my vocabulary. Now, this particular book, I'm pretty sure my father bought at this long-departed bookstore, Pickwick Books on Hollywood Boulevard. And I remember wandering between these stacks. I remember these tables covered with these books. And it was just this incredible institution. And here is another place where my journey crisscrosses with that of another writer, because unbeknownst to me and to my father, just a few years earlier, Susan Sontag had been caught shoplifting books at this particular bookstore, right? This was one of her favorite bookstores, Pickwick Books. Susan Sontag grew up in North Hollywood, so she would take a bus or drive over the hills to come to Pickwick Books. And so my path crossed with that of Susan Sontag at this late departed Hollywood Boulevard bookstore. Now, in terms of actually writing and becoming a writer of prose, I would have to say that one of the foundational moments of my journey into becoming a prose writer was having to memorize this particular speech. This is Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Now, when I was growing up, and I don't know, I'm pretty sure they don't do this in school anymore, everybody had to memorize the Gettysburg Address. And so in the 6th grade, I was standing on a stage much like this one, leading my class in reciting the Gettysburg Address, 7 years ago, et cetera, et cetera. And what I think I took away from this as a writer, because I wasn't really asked, I can't remember ever being asked to memorize anything else in elementary school or junior high school, or actually high school. Being asked to memorize a text makes you familiar with that text. It makes you enter into the rhythms of it. And so I remember the rhythms of the Gettysburg Address, and above all, its simplicity and elegance. I've always been a really spare writer. I try, and also this part of that is the influence of writing in newspapers, say as much as you can with as few words. And my writing instruction, I didn't really get much writing instruction at any level in school. But I do remember in elementary school, about the same time I was learning the Gettysburg Address, they showed us a film strip on writing. And I think about that film strip, which I probably saw when I was in the 4th or 5th grade, almost every day, because it taught me some basics. Sentence variety, right? Don't always write sentences of the same length. Make them short and long and short, give us variety in sentences. Do not repeat words. These are things that I learned in my Los Angeles public school in Hollywood, in some very, very basic lessons. Now, like a lot of us growing up in the United States of my generation, our first sort of entry into becoming regular book buyers was the Scholastic Book Club. So on the left here, we have a book order. This is actually more from like the 1990s for the Scholastic Book Club. Did anybody here ever buy Scholastic books in school? Yes, many people did. I remember just the joy of what would happen was that your class would order these books. You'd mark them on this sheet, and that about a month later or a few weeks later, a box of books would come, and the teacher would parcel out the books, right? And one of the books I remember buying, and I'm pretty sure it was when I was in high school, was 3 Tragedies by Shakespeare. Now, I had a terrible literary education. I can't remember a single thing I learned in any of my English classes in high school. But I do remember the witches in Macbeth from the copy that I bought through the Scholastic Book Club. So thank God for that institution. And then, just a few years ago, I discovered that my son went to college with like the grandson of one of the founders of Scholastic Books, and who started this book club program. So, but when I was growing up, the books, many of the books we had in the house were in Spanish. And my father was and still is kind of, a Guatemalan exceptionalist. He would say that Guatemala was one of the best countries on earth, that we spoke the best Spanish, which is a ridiculous statement. But he said we spoke the best Spanish, and he took a special pride, I almost said special pride, he took special pride in the fact that a few years before he had moved to the United States, Miguel Ángel Asturias, the novelist and anthropologist and just all-around writer, had won the Nobel Prize for literature. And so my father had these books hanging around the house. These were the first novels that we had that I ever saw, really. But I couldn't read them because I never learned to read Spanish. I didn't learn to read and write in Spanish as a kid. Now, these particular books are have these wonderful woodcut covers, and they're published by Losada, which is a publishing house in Buenos Aires. And so I grew up with this idea that books were something that made you special. That reading books, that writing books was something that gave you gravitas, that they made you, they just elevated you. Because my father had this deep respect for Miguel Ángel Asturias and had read many of his books. Now, the first literary book that I can remember reading was one that I'm pretty sure my father read while he was going to night school to get his AA degree, or maybe even to get his high school equivalency, because he did both when I was a kid. And one day he brought home The Jungle. He said, Hijo, you should read this book. This novel's pretty good, The Jungle. Of course, the classic expose 1906 novel about a Lithuanian immigrant trying to find his way through the meatpacking industry. And this novel, I remember to this day, I read it more than 40 years ago, right? But this was the first literary novel that I read. And when I started to become a really avid reader, I wasn't reading stuff like The Jungle, right? I was reading more stuff like this. I was reading these sort of pulp, espionage, adventure thrillers. And I truly enjoyed all three of Frederick Forsyth's books from the 1970s, his thrillers, Day of the Jackal, about a guy trying to assassinate Charles de Gaulle, The Odessa File, about a man trying to track down a network of former Nazis in South America and elsewhere, and another one, The Dogs of War, which is about an attempted coup in Africa. So, this was my literary world, was pulp thrillers like Day of the Jackal and The Odessa File. And every year I bought a copy of the World Almanac. I told this to my son, and he said, Papa, that's seriously geeky. Because the World Almanac was the internet before the internet existed, okay? The World Almanac had, first of all, summaries of the histories of all these different nations, facts about their government, lists of the Academy Award winners every year, baseball champions, everything you could think of, right? Stock reports, all of this gathered every year into the World Almanac. Every year I had to buy a new one. And my father, at about the same time, introduced me to a lot of self-help. Actually, I remember a lot of the books my father read. Very, very, Carlos Castaneda, these crazy books about tripping on drugs. He read those too and would talk to me about them. I never read those. But I did read a book that he recommended to me, which was How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. And so this is a book that, as I wrote in The New Yorker, my first piece in The New Yorker was about my father telling me to read Dale Carnegie. Because Dale Carnegie says, look, one of the things, he's basically teaching Midwesterners how to be like Latinos, right? So he was telling them things like, remember people's name, make eye contact, say something that's sincerely flattering, to someone. Give them a compliment, but it has to be sincere, right? So my father talked endlessly about Dale Carnegie, and at his insistence, I read it. But finally, I got off to college, and I was able to sort of to really take a deep dive into literature and ideas. Now, I was a pre-med major when I went to college. I was a biology major. I went to study to be a doctor, but it was the 1980s, and the university had just started granting tenure to all these crazy feminists and Marxists. So I fell under the sway of all these Marxists. And so I started reading the Communist Manifesto and all this other stuff. And someone told me in one of my circle of Marxist radicals that there was this novel by an African-American guy, a black African-American communist from the 30s. And I thought, man, I got to read that. So I went to my local used bookstore, Logos, in downtown Santa Cruz, because I went to the University of California, Santa Cruz, and I bought Native Son by Richard Wright, and I was totally blown away. It was like the first angry novel about race that I had read. It tells the story of a young black man who falls in with a circle of communists and ends up killing a white woman, and he has to flee for his life. He's eventually captured and convicted, and he's put on trial. It's an amazing, angry novel. Today, when I reread that book, it just feels so raw. It feels like Richard Wright wrote it when he was in prison. You know, it was just an amazing, amazing book. And then after reading Richard Wright, I just fell into African-American literature because this was what everybody was reading. Everybody who was progressive, everybody was reading Toni Morrison especially. I read The Bluest Eye, I read Sula, I read, of course, Song of Solomon. I read Alice Walker, The Color Purple, her novel, underappreciated novel, Meridian, which is about an activist in the civil rights movement. And so these became some of my really very early college literary influences. And I was groping, you know, I never took a literature class which is bizarre. I never took a literature class when I was in college. I took classes in Latin American history. I took classes in Marxist theory and political economy. So my literary education was something that I was giving myself. And, oh, here we go. And then I decided also to learn Spanish when I went to college. So I took a class called Spanish for Spanish speakers, what we would now call a heritage speaker class. And so I read my first books in Spanish. Pablo Neruda's incredible poetry, Odas Elementales, very, very simple free verse poems in which he takes an object like artichokes, right, or copper, and he writes an ode, a very, very simple ode. Great for a beginning Spanish speaker. And then, of course, as I got better in Spanish, I read 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez in Spanish, the first novel that I completed in Spanish. I told my father about him. I gave my father a copy of this novel, and he said, "Hijo, Macondo," because Macondo is the town, right, in 100 Years of Solitude. He said, "My hometown, Hualan. Hualan is Macondo. It's Macondo. It's the same thing." And he was just totally blown away. And so in that moment, I had sort of completed a circle, right? Because my father had left this village, come to the United States, paid for his son to go to college. His son brings him a book that's about a village like the one that he grew up in, right? And so I had managed to close a circle. So I continued to sort of just read widely. Like I said, I think I spent more time in the library and more time in used bookstores than I did in the classroom. And I just followed my interests where they would go. And I read a lot of African literature. I read a lot of Sembene Ousmane, a Senegalese writer, including his novel Shala, which is a great sort of satire of masculinity in West Africa. And the great Nadine Gordimer, daughter of Jewish South African activists, someone who, warrior against apartheid. And of course, J.M. Coetzee, the other South African writer, they both won the Nobel Prize, his Waiting for the Barbarians. And among the many, many African novelists that I read, there was Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan writer. Kenyan writer wrote this book, Detained, which I still remember vividly, because towards the end, he's thrown in prison for his political beliefs. He writes a novel on toilet paper, while he's in prison. And it's the first novel ever written in his native language, which is Gikuyu, which is one of the native languages of Kenya. Now, I'm on the same department. I'm in the same staff with Ngugi wa Thiong'o. We're both in the English department, right? So that's another sort of circle that has closed for me. Now, another thing I did in college, and I really totally try to tell this to my students, I tell them how important it is to take the opportunity to do study abroad if you can. So I went to Mexico City when I was an undergraduate, and I took classes at the National University there, the National Autonomous University, the UNAM. And I lived a few blocks from this bookstore, the famous Libreria Gandhi. This particular location no longer exists. But it's this incredible bookstore, one of the biggest and largest and best independent bookstores in Mexico City. And at that time, when I was there in the 1980s, there was this cafe above it. You can sort of see it here in this picture. And in that cafe, it was filled with exiles from all over Latin America because this was the era of the dictatorships. So there were Argentines there and Chileans and Guatemalans, right? All hanging out together. And I would go there, walk down from my apartment, buy a copy of the New York Times newspaper, sit on the second floor and read the newspaper. And every once in a while, one of the older guys would say, "Señor, ¿dónde compró usted esa copia del New York Times?" And I would say, "Allá abajo, señor." And I'd have a conversation with these exiles, which was really cool. And among the many, many books that I bought, now that I could read Spanish, and which are now in my growing collection of thousands of books, is Elena Poniatowska, her book, La Noche de Tlatelolco, which is an oral history of the 1968 student uprising that ended with a massacre just before the 1968 Olympics. A really powerful work of journalism, and perhaps one of the first works of journalism that I ever read. So, moving quickly ahead in my reading life, and I graduated from college, floated around, got a job at a community newspaper, eventually got an internship at the Los Angeles Times to be a reporter at the LA Times. Now, there's always been these cliches about newspaper writers. And once upon a time, the cliche was that every newspaper reporter had in his drawer or her drawer a novel. Now it's that every newspaper reporter has a screenplay in their drawer. But back then, there were still a lot of newspaper reporters who had novels that they wanted to write. And so there was a very sort of literary kind of feel among us reporters, right? We had to go cover police stuff. We had to write features on, neighborhoods. But a lot of us had literary aspirations, and especially the Los Angeles Times, because at that time in the 1980s, when I joined the staff, essentially many of the best reporters from all over the United States were ending up at the Los Angeles Times. And I remember I was with a group of interns, and we all made lists of our favorite books. And one of the other interns, included Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, which I read for the first time when I was in my mid-20s as a reporter. And it just blew me away. And I remember taking a passage from Invisible Cities, making a copy of it and sticking it on my terminal and having that quote look at me during my entire career, because it was the way that Calvino wrote about this imaginary city, which really was Venice. I thought, I need to write about LA as if it was this imaginary city. Now, Don DeLillo I discovered for the first time thanks to one of my colleagues, Steve Braun, who was another one of these guys with a literary bent. Hector, you got to read DeLillo. And I read Libro, which is this incredible story in which DeLillo imagines Oswald's life inside of a conspiracy. And it's an amazing book, although at the end he sort of makes Oswald sort of not kill him, even though I know Oswald really did it, but that's another story, right? And so I started getting the idea that I could write novels, and so I started reading widely in fiction. And I remember one of the first times I ever went to a bookstore and saw a novelist, saw a fiction writer speak, was when I went to Santa Monica and I saw Sandra Cisneros speak at the old Midnight Special bookstore in Santa Monica. And she read from her collection, Woman Hollering Creek, Just a really beautiful collection of stories, really edgy. If you've read The House on Mango Street, it's essentially the girl from those stories, but she's now older and having sex and having affairs. That's what The Woman Hollering Creek is, okay? And it sort of what it showed me was that somebody from my background, somebody, a son of immigrants, a child of immigrants, that kind of person can write literary fiction. And so it inspired me because I had heard that Sandra Cisneros had gone to the University of Iowa's writing workshop. And so I thought I should do that too. I didn't know that she hated Iowa, but I decided I needed to do that. So I started reading a lot of fiction. And every year I would buy Best American Short Stories, and I would read the stories in Best American Short Stories. I went and took night classes. While I was still a reporter, I took night classes at UCLA Extension to learn how to write short stories, how to write fiction, to learn, because I thought of it that way. And I'm happy to say that 24 years later, after reading Best American Short Stories for the first time, I was in Best American Short Stories. Sorry, little name drop there. Not the last one. And I have another second story going in Best American Short Stories this year, 2022. So that would be 30 years. Oh my God, 30 years later. Okay. At that time, I also read Dennis Johnson, the incredible late Dennis Johnson, short story writer. This collection, Jesus' Son, really impacted me. And I have this copy here. You can see FSG, Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, really famous New York publishing house. All these great books that I read, they all said FSG on the side. And I thought, my God, what an incredible, FSG, what is that? Well, now they're my publisher. They publish my books. I am an FSG writer, which is crazy. It's crazy that I've had this journey. And so I published my first novel, The Tattooed Soldier. I wrote my first novel when I was here at UC Irvine, at the English department here, doing my writing workshop. And that novel was really informed by a peculiar obsession which I really developed in the 1980s and 90s, which was my obsession with the Holocaust. And I read about this in my next book, about why is it that a Guatemalan American kid growing up in the United States in the 1980s and 90s would be obsessed with the Holocaust. And it's kind of a complicated answer, but I just read really widely on the Holocaust as I was writing the novel, The Tattooed Soldier, which is about a genocide in Guatemala. So I was sort of backgrounding myself on genocide. And I read Robert J. Lifton's, he's a psychologist, his book on the doctors who worked in the camps, right? Doctors take a Hippocratic oath, and yet there were doctors present making the selections, who went to the gas chamber, who didn't. Doctors using the bodies of Jewish inmates to perform medical experiments, right? Robert J. Lifton interviewed these doctors after the war and took apart their psychology, their rationalizations. And those rationalizations became the foundation of the rationalizations of my genocidal maniac in the novel, The Tattooed Soldier. Now, the one thing I have up here that's not in these slides, it's not a book or a piece of writing, is Claude Lanzmann's incredible 9-hour documentary, Shoah, which I saw when I was in my 20s in San Francisco. I sat through all 9 hours of this. It was in 2 parts with a little lunch break in the middle. And I left that theater just shaken. It was just an incredible documentary. If you haven't seen it, you have to see it. It's even more difficult to watch now that we've had this really powerful nativist movement in the United States. And the most recent time I saw it, I felt even more shaken because it reminded me so much of our times. And finally here, I have one of the many other Holocaust books I read, Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution in Poland, by the historian Christopher Browning, which is a history of this police battalion that participates in some of the first massacres on the Eastern Front. And it really sort of helped me think about how do I construct someone who gets involved in a campaign of ethnic cleansing, of genocide. Another crazy connection here is that when I sold my novel, The Tattooed Soldier, I sold it to an editor who had edited this book, Joy Johansson. Just another sort of crazy coincidence. And so as I tried to write more books, I realized as I was getting deeper into my 30s and into my 40s, that I had some incredibly huge gaps in my education. And now I realize all writers feel we have gaps in our education. It's just a common thing to a writer. But I did not read Shakespeare seriously until I was in my 40s. And I remember going to, I was very lucky at the LA Times to get a job as the LA Times Buenos Aires foreign correspondent. And so I would go to the English language bookstore in Buenos Aires, and I would buy these particular copies of Shakespeare, the Cambridge School Shakespeare. And I bought Measure for Measure and Hamlet, Twelfth Night, everything, Macbeth. And they're just they're really wonderfully annotated. And so I realized for the first time that Shakespeare was someone who had to fill the seats for the groundlings. So he had to tell these really crude sex jokes, but he also had to fill the seats on the top where all the elite came, right in the Globe Theater. And so Shakespeare is this incredible combination of someone who's trying to please the crowd and someone who's trying to please his Oxford-educated friends. And you can just sort of sense it when you look at Hamlet on the ground level, right? Also in my 40s, I read Don Quixote for the first time in this wonderful translation that I highly recommend by Edith Grossman. She is Gabriel Garcia Marquez's translator into English. And just, it was so accessible and it was so funny. And I realized that Don Quixote is, among other things, it's this work of realism. It's this work that's telling us that the real world is more interesting and crazy than any fantasy. So I read Don Quixote in my 40s. And then as I tried to write a second novel, which was a long and tortured process that involved lots of rejection, because it was a novel about a family from Orange County, a family that I imagined. And I got rejected. My first agent, the late Virginia Barber, told me when she read my second novel, because it was about an undocumented immigrant who gets caught up in this web of accusations and whatnot. She said, "Hector, that's a polemic." Now, Virginia Barber, my late agent, my first agent, was also the agent of Alice Munro, a Canadian writer who later, of course, won the Nobel Prize. And so I thought to myself, I really need to think about how to write about family. Who are the greats who write about domestic spaces? So as I was a reporter living in Mexico, I read Chekhov, and I read John Cheever, and I read Alice Munro, right? And I taught myself how to write literature about family because I'm an emotional nincompoop. My emotional intelligence is very low. Thanks to becoming a father and thanks to reading, thanks to having 3 kids and being married for many years, I was finally able to sort of create believable domestic spaces. And my novel, The Barbarian Nurseries, which resulted from this, I sold to FSG and also to many foreign translations, including French. And when I sold The Barbarian Nurseries into French, I got invited to these literary festivals because the French are to fiction what Brazilians are to soccer. They love reading. They read everything. They just read, and tons of fiction and translation. So I got invited to this festival where about 20 American authors were invited to this festival in Paris. Actually, it's just outside of Paris. And this photographer here in the corner, she corrals me. And in fact, there were all these photographers floating. So there's a subculture of photographers in France who take pictures of authors. And so all of them were at this particular event. And so this woman, Sophie Basouls, she starts taking these crazy pictures of me. And there's one of them down here. Here I am. That's me. That's the picture she took of me at the festival. And I asked her, wow, so you take pictures of authors? And I said, because I'm a journalist, I said, what's the favorite author? Who's your favorite author you photographed? She thought about it for a second and she said, Nabokov. And this is her photograph of Vladimir Nabokov, right? One of my heroes, one of my son's heroes. My oldest son, he's a computer programmer, but he memorized the first page of Lolita. When I showed him the slide, he started reciting it to me. So Sophie Basouls takes a picture of Nabokov and takes a picture of me. And on this particular slide here, I've tried to capture the relative importance of our careers in world literature. As you can see, I'm very small down here in the corner, and Nabokov is huge, right? Because Nabokov is one of the giants of world literature. Now, I realized deep into my 40s, as I sent my kids to high school, I realized for the first time just how poor my own public school education had been, because I sent my kids to a really fancy private school and spent all my book advances that I had earned, all the money I earned selling my books, I put into my kids to go to private school in Southern California. They all went to Flint Ridge Prep. My daughter is graduating from Flint Ridge Prep, my third child this year. And they have this thing over the summer, they all have to read the same book. So the first year that my first son went to Flint Ridge Prep, they read the Odyssey in translation by Robert Fagles. And I read this because I wanted to join my son in reading this. And I realized that, yes, I had read the Odyssey when I was in high school, but I had not read any Odyssey like the one that my son was reading, because there's a scene where Athena has a bunch of maids undress Odysseus and bathe him in oil. And I thought, if I read that when I was 14 years old, I would have remembered that. And I didn't read it because I was given the cartoon version of the Odyssey. In fact, I remember the copy of the Odyssey I read. It had these cartoons, these drawings in it. Whereas my son gets to read the Robert Fagles translation with the wine-dark sea and the maidens, putting oil over Odysseus' naked body. And their reading was was so challenging and so crazy. Two of my sons read this Martin McDonagh play, The Pillowman, which is about two guys who kill children. I mean, it's like, my son is like 16 years old. And they were just being given all of this incredibly challenging, rich literature to read, which I did not read until I was in my 30s and 40s. And so I realized just how much I had been trying to make up for. And, just to continue, each one of these books now is related to a book that I wrote. So I wrote a book about these Chilean miners who trapped right underneath 600 feet of, 600 feet of rock, 600 meters of rock. And I was just sort of so deeply influenced by the great nonfiction tradition of the United States, right, of nonfiction writing. Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, I read while I was writing my book on the Chilean miners, right? His famous nonfiction novel. It invents this genre, right? The nonfiction novel. And Susan Orlean's absolutely unforgettable account of a man who steals orchids, The Orchid Thief, which really is a story not just about orchids, it's about obsession, right? And the nature of obsessions. And so just to keep plowing forward here, almost done. There's just so much to read, and a lot of things that I read are things that people give me or say, Hector, will you be on a panel about Roberto Bolano? So I was asked to be on a panel about Roberto Bolano. Problem, I've never read Roberto Bolano. So I just did this concentrated reading of Roberto Bolano, and among the many things that blew me away was his novel 2666, which, I think that when I do my reading, I'm looking for people who can teach me something new, something I haven't realized that prose could do. And so Roberto Bolano was in my head. This is a novel that I would spend another 40 minutes talking about this novel because I've read it 3 times, once in Spanish, in a great audiobook in Spanish. But essentially, Bolano was entering these spaces in which his prose goes to these mental states, right? That were just really challenging to me. And trying to push the language in this way to sort of match his madness. And I did that as I was writing a book about an American guy who had done something that was very sort of unlikely for a blonde American guy to do, which is that he joined a guerrilla army in Latin America. So my most recent novel, The Last Great Road Bum, is about a blonde American guy who joined the Salvadoran rebel movement in the 1980s and ended up dying in the guerrilla movement. And when I first heard about him, I thought about Che Guevara and this incredible, one of the best biographies I've ever read, biography of Che by John Lee Anderson called Che, A Revolutionary Life. And so this idea of writing this story about a blonde Che Guevara was the thing that sort of helped me in writing this novel. And it's never too late to get caught up. So I thought, well, I'm a writer. I'm trying to write. These deeply literary texts. What should I read? What haven't I read? What's the great challenge, the great white whale of literature that, basically kills everybody who tries to read it? And for me, of course, it would have been Ulysses, right? Ulysses, which is famous as one of the most impenetrable texts you could ever try to read. And I read a third of Ulysses thanks to this podcaster, Frank Delaney. And Frank Delaney is this guy who grew up in Dublin in the middle of the 20th century and who understands all the sort of very specific references that are inside Ulysses, references to songs, references, to horse races that used to take place in Dublin and opera singers. And so I've tried through my life to continue my literary education, right? To never think of it as being over, to always sort of try to cover another one of my blind spots. I grew up knowing I got a really poor public school education in literature and that I needed to cover these empty spaces. And I've never lost that feeling. And so for me as a writer, one of the most important things I possess is my insecurity, right? Because it's my insecurity that keeps me reading and even reading Ulysses, and also to recognize there's things I don't know. So for example, we've had in the last 10, 15 years, all of this explosion of writing and thinking, a kind of revolution about the idea of gender and identity, right? And in my own family, my daughter, teenager, came out. My daughter's gay. And in fact, she didn't even have to come out. It was more like we just sort of knew that she was dating other girls. And so I'm thinking about her life and thinking about many lessons she's taught me. I realized I need to read. There are things that I need to read. And so I read Virginia Woolf's incredible novel, Orlando, written in the 1920s. And it's this sort of cross-gendered time travel novel in which one person, who at the beginning of the book is a man living in Elizabethan England, and at the end of the book is living in 1920s London, but is a woman, has this journey through English literature. Shakespeare makes a cameo and all kinds of other English writers. And, so just trying always to fill the gaps, learn new things. I am embarrassed to say that I did not read this book, James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, until a few years ago. Written in the 1960s, his great essay, denunciation of what it means to be black in the United States in the 1960s, I think a book that should be mandatory in every high school. I should have read this growing up in the 1970s, right? In Los Angeles, I should have read this when I went to high school. Instead, I read it after I had already written 5 books. After I'd written 5 books, I read James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. And The Fire Next Time is the inspiration for my next book, the one that will come out next year. It's called Our Migrant Souls, Race, and the Myths and Meanings of Latino, right? And so James Baldwin was a big inspiration for that. And I was putting this together, and I was looking at this cover and looking at this slide, and then I looked at the pictures by Sophie Bassoul. And Sophie Bassoul, that photographer who took my picture in Paris, she also took this famous picture of James Baldwin. So I thought about that. I realized that yesterday as I was putting together this talk, and I realized, oh my God, it's like James Baldwin is sending me a message, through her lens. Because when you're a writer, so much of it is really based on faith, and it really is important to think that you have these mystical forces behind you. And I feel like I've had many angels who've protected me on my journey, to become a writer and to continue to practice this thing that matters so much to me, which is reading. So thank you very much. And I'll take your questions.
If you're here in the audience, if you can raise your hand, we'll recognize you, we'll get you a microphone. If you're still on Zoom, if we can just request everybody show your picture. If you need to leave, we understand, so don't worry about that. But if you're on Zoom, please let us see your picture, and at the bottom of your screen, that raise your hand icon. So any questions? Yes. Hang on.
Well, first I'd like to say it was really interesting seeing like all the stories about your life. I guess my question is, how do you bring some of the things you've learned in literature into the classroom?
Wow, I think that that's a great question. How do I bring what I've learned into the classroom? Well, I mean, might be kind of hard to believe after sitting here watching me talk, but I try to bring my humility into the classroom. I try to bring this because I feel like it's a series of accidents that made me into a writer, and that and really it's just passion. It's this passion, and I try to communicate that passion into the classroom, and the fact that really our stories, and especially because I have so many Chicano Latino students at UC Irvine, that our stories deserve to be memorialized. They deserve to be preserved and told within the covers of a book, as much as any other stories do. And I like to share what I've learned about that process, which is, I've learned over the course of more than 35 years of being a professional writer, and share that with my students. And also to continue to be curious. And so to me, every class is a lesson. Every class is my students teaching me something, especially since almost all of my classes involve student writing and students writing nonfiction narratives. And so I continue to be taught almost every day. I mean, I'm teaching 2 classes this quarter, and my students are teaching me about the divisions of class society in the United States. They're teaching me about the self-image of Latino people and how that fits into this society that sends us ideas about what is normal and what isn't. So I would, it's something that I'm trying to constantly use my curiosity and make it into a little bit of an engine inside the classroom so that we learn together. Thank you.
Any other questions? In Zoom?
Hola, Raúl.
Hola, ¿me escuchas?
Sí, te escucho.
Okay. Listen, thank you for this very informative talk. Now I know a lot more about you than you know about me. I do have a question, maybe it relates to your humility. I have always felt, I think you're being too humble when you discuss Barbarian Nurseries. I read that book and I felt that if that book had been written about families that live in New York or New Jersey, it would have been very well received.
Yeah, it was. It was called Bonfire of the Vanities. Yeah.
I just wonder if the initial reactions from the editor had something to do that this was far away, know-nothing Orange County, as opposed to New Jersey or New York.
Well, I was really lucky because the editor of that novel, Sean McDonald, who at that moment had started off, he was at Nantalie's Doubleday, and he was moving to Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. He is from Orange County. And Sean McDonald is someone who has always been interested in California. And so I'm very, very lucky to have a California editor who works in New York. But I think that it's really interesting to watch. You can find a publisher for any book, I think. But it's interesting to see what happens to the book when it enters literary culture. And when the arbiters of quote unquote genius or greatness or the arbiters of critical praise, how they react to the book. And I think it's undoubtable that it's just unarguable that Latino writers, we face obstacles in our books entering into this literary circuit of literary production. I have been so lucky compared to the average Latino writer because I've been reviewed in the New York Times, and there are so many great Latino writers who have never been recognized by the New York Review of Books, which never reviews anything Latino, or the New York Times. Just so many really great writers who just don't get that. And so I've been very fortunate. And there are walls. Breaking down that walls is not just something you do as a writer. I think our society needs to break down more walls in order for that to change.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions here? Oh, right here.
Can you please describe your experience with the screenplay adaptation of your book into film?
Well, that would be another. Yeah. So my book on the Chilean miners, it was a interesting process. I learned a lot about film. I think that the final product was faithful to the central message of my book, which was that this adventure story really wasn't just an adventure story. It was a love story. It was about the love that these men had for each other and that their families and their country had for them. But, you know, film is an industry that has a lot more money at stake than the book world does. And because there is this money at stake, people make some really strange decisions, and they tend to try to do things that are less risky, right? It's a sort of, you know, quasi-capitalistic enterprise, your average film, and so the thing that really shapes. It's funny because I have to be in a panel at 5:00 answering the same question. The thing that the equation, the mathematical equation that really determines a lot of how films are made is the star, because the stars all walk around with little numbers over their heads, and so very often stories and decisions about production design, et cetera, are made to try to serve the star, or to serve the idea of what the audience is going to be. And so Mike Medavoy, God bless him, wonderful man, he was determined to make a movie that opened to a wide release across the United States, more than 2,000 theaters. And his decisions, which he influenced the screenwriter and the director, were to go mainstream and to be a little bit melodramatic and a little maudlin. And so the story really doesn't respect a lot of the sort of cultural specificity of the Chilean miners, and I think that was a mistake. However, as Patricia Riggin, the director, pointed out, you know, it was one of the first movies about a Latino subject in Latin America to have a huge wide release like that, you know, with an all Latino cast. So, you know, I have mixed feelings about it, but I really learned a lot from the process. Should I ever write another screenplay? Somebody else?
Anybody else? Maybe just a quick question. Hector, in terms of your amazing career, did you ever have a point that you thought you'd have to quit, that your career had stalled? You know,
I was talking to my wife about this last night because I was having a really interesting experience with a particular American newspaper that was very frustrating. But I did, you know, and I was thinking, you know, at one point I thought, I don't want to have my name on the story anymore. I'm going to just quit. And I didn't. I sort of stuck to it. And I've always done that. I've always plowed ahead. I mean, I had a book that I spent, 3 years working on that was rejected by every publisher. I remember that day. It was the day my second son was it was a year old. And I remember weeping, thinking that my literary career was over. But I've always plowed ahead because I have two voices in my head. One is the arrogant voice of my father, God bless him, who always told me that I was special. And the other one is the voice of my mother, who always told me that I was loved and that I was the product of their love. And I think, and you asked earlier, somebody asked about students. And this is like, this is something that I think all of us carry. We carry this notion that we're worth something. So my mother's voice in my head telling me that I was the product of love always made me believe I was worth something. And not all kids grow up that way. So I know that voice in my head is the one that says, you know what, you rejected me, screw you. I'm gonna try again, That, because you have to really have a lot of self-belief. Especially as a writer, we deal with rejection all the time. Rejection is the daily meal of a writer. And so to have that much self-belief, and I think about where it comes from, and a lot of it goes back to my mother, my crazy mother. I was our only child. I'm our only child, and just the joy of life that she taught me.
Very good. I think we might have one more Zoom
yes,
question.
Yes.
Oh, do we?
there was a question in the chat. Thank you for a fabulous talk. But
Oh, thank you.
I noticed a question in the chat, which is actually the question that was just asked. I was wondering, was there a time that you wanted to quit your passion, and how did you deal with that? I think that was pretty much the same as the question you just
Yeah, but I could talk more about it.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think, it's just almost, it's pretty much wired into who I am now. It's not something that I could ever stop. I worry sometimes, because, writing is also a physical act. And our bodies are linked to it. So I worry sometimes about, in a distant future, the moment when I could no longer physically able, like I was 2 days ago, I was up at 3 o'clock in the morning to make a 9 o'clock deadline. And that is a physical toll on your body and on your mental health. And, but it's so much, I would say that pretty much it's so much wired into my frame of mind. It's so much wired into my daily sense of self that really I'll only stop when my body finally gives up. And I know a lot of great writers have written their best work, very, very late in their careers. José Saramago, the great Portuguese writer, his book Blindness is a book I think he wrote in his 70s, which is one of another book I could have put up here in my list of books that inspired me. So, and it's like, yeah, okay, so maybe, and it's also you give yourself, writing isn't, the thing is too that writing isn't a huge task. Writing is always the little thing that you have in front of you. It's the sentence or the paragraph. And so just working on a sentence or a paragraph every morning, it's a pleasurable thing. It doesn't have to end in some huge, tome. It doesn't have to end in some great magnum opus, although we always think in the back of our heads that's where it's going. So, but just that daily sort of, for me, out of 365 days a year, I'm probably writing 359 of them, which is insane, and I'd only take like 5 or 6 days off a year. It's insane, but it's just so much a part of my being, and it's given me so much joy. And to be able to impart that to my students and to audiences and to my readers, I really firmly believe that when you're happy writing something, when you have energy, the reader picks up on that. And it takes me back, and this now is the last thing that I'll say, because I think this is a nice way to close this. I wrote a piece once about little children learning to read and early child literacy. And I met this expert. I talked to this expert, and she said that that when little kids are read to, that's really, really important, because a child who has a parent read to them understands that act of reading is an act of love. Okay? So when my kids were small, I read to them all 13 volumes of A Series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket, another series of books I could have put. And so I loved so much reading that to them, and I just loved the ritual of it, In the morning before they went off to school, I'd read like a half chapter or a quarter chapter. And so when a kid grows up that way, when a kid grows up listening to someone read to them, they take that act of love, the expert told me, and they transfer it to the book. So the book becomes this object of love. And I think that's what reading does. When you read to your children and when you put joy into your work, it transmits that love to the reader in one way or another. So thanks. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much, Professor Hector Tobar. Bravo, bravo. I loved how you ended it.